Denzel Washington is an actor I've been linked to since I started talking movies. He's my favourite actor, he's my profile picture on Twitter and Discord, he's my most watched actor as per Letterboxd, and I did a whole video on why I think he's the greatest of all time. I'm constantly watching Denzel movies and I finally managed to watch every single Denzel film there is. Now, I didn't count any of the documentaries he's in, but I did count the TV movies, which is absolutely tragic on my behalf. So I decided, since I hit 3,000 subscribers recently, thank you everybody, to do a video I've wanted to do for a while, and that is ranking and reviewing every single Denzel film to date, including Gladiator 2, which I had the pleasure of catching this last weekend. So there's a lot of movies, and most of the bottom ones I'm not even going to say much about at all. They're ones I've seen once and maybe a few months ago at this point, so I barely remember them, but stick with me. Once we get to the good stuff and about halfway through the list, that's when I get to say more things about the movies because they stick with me more, and yeah, I don't want to waste any more time because the video is long enough, I am sure. At 55 we have Carbon Copy, and I don't even want to linger on this one too long. It is just a stinker. It's the only one on this entire list that I would actively call really bad. The basic premise is that this rich white dude finds out he has a black kid played by Denzel, and as a result he loses his entire life, his career, his family, his house, and he has to go and live in the ghetto with Denzel. It's just such a bizarre movie, and as a Denzel movie, it still sucks. Washington is completely serviceable and is very easily the highlight, but being the highlight in Carbon Copy is like finding a Cheerio in a pile of dog shit. You're still not gonna eat it. It's just completely bland, and there is no reason to see this unless you're doing some kind of Denzel completion like this. Next up we have another little stinker, but it isn't as bad. It's For Queen and Country, which is just an odd little movie. Denzel plays a paratrooper from London who fought in the Falklands War, and upon coming home struggles to readjust and meets a society that openly rejects him and blah blah blah. It's a fine movie. The only reason it's this low is that, for one, Denzel's Cockney accent is not very good. It's better than Don Cheadle's in Oceans, but that's not a very high bar really, is it? And I found that this film has more fans than I expected, but it doesn't entirely surprise me at the same time. It has decent commentary on Thatcherism, the very weird Falklands War that has been mostly forgotten by now, and I think could be equated to a sort of Rambo type story. Not very much in execution, but in the way we talk about vets returning home to a country that doesn't much care for their problems and doesn't facilitate their issues. It's just trying too hard, and I can't see why they cast Denzel at all, especially when everyone else in the cast is actually British. It's also not like he was a big name at the time that they could bank on. It wouldn't be that much of a problem if he worked in the role, but I just don't think he does. I think out of all of Denzel's movies, this is the one where he feels the most out of place, the most awkward. But it isn't a terrible movie overall. It's on like YouTube if you want to go and see it, but I wouldn't personally recommend it. Anyway, at 53 we have our first TV movie with Wilma, and this isn't necessarily a bad movie either. It's exactly what you'd expect from a 1977 TV movie to be. It's the real life story of Olympian Wilma Rudolph, who overcame polio in childhood and went on to become a record holding Olympian. She won 1 bronze and 3 gold medals in sprinting between the 1956 Melbourne and the 1960 Rome Olympics. This can also be found on YouTube, which is where I saw it in dazzling quality, and it's a biopic that just doesn't have the budget or the talent behind it to make it truly phenomenal. Shirley Jo Finney does a decent job as Wilma, and Denzel is in the movie for like a total of 5 minutes, but that's kind of the only reason this film is even remembered. He does completely okay in the scenes, but again, it's all just a bit bland and subdued the whole time that I will likely remember nothing of it in a month's time. This is, however, Denzel's first acting credit, so it does have that going for it, and I will say though, Cicely Tyson, who plays Wilma's mother, Blanche Rudolph, is a standout and all scenes with her are enjoyable. Okay, moving to 52 we have another TV movie in the shape of License to Kill. I've got next to nothing to say on this one, aside that it is just an incredibly bland drunk driving PSA. It has has an okay cast, and Denzel is of course the standout, despite also being in this very little. Also despite what the poster may lead you to believe, they have his face slapped on there. He is barely in this movie. Do not get sold a whole performance from him, because he's just not really in it. I mean, it's a step above the others in terms of pace, in terms of a Denzel performance, and it executes its purpose perfectly, but it is still just a standard Lifetime TV movie. It's also nothing you'll likely remember a week after seeing it. God, I can't wait until we get to the really good movies so I can actually talk about some stuff. Okay, next up, we're out of the kind of bad territory and into the kind of whatever territory. Starting with 1995's Virtuosity, starring both Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe in this sci-fi action crime thriller that is all sorts of okay. The effects that seem to be the bedrock of this film's inception are terrible. Some of the worst I've probably ever seen. The plot is contrived, the action is mediocre. It's as if you combined every 80s sci-fi movie but halved the budget. It's just cliche, and if it were not for the leads, this would really not exist. In that, I just can't see anyone giving this movie the time of day if it were not for the leads. But the general premise is that Russell Crowe plays a virtual reality villain whose programming consists of more than 150 serial killers' personalities, and Denzel plays the cop that is hunting him down. There's maybe a good movie in here somewhere. I like the premise, and I think it would probably be better done now, or even maybe just done better by a better filmmaker, someone like James Cameron, but I just think it needed a lot more time in the pan to really cook through and work out a lot of its problems and contrivances. It's not bad, but it's not necessarily good either. Okay, so entering our top 50, we have another TV movie. This one is also on YouTube, and it clocks in at about 3 hours. But if this one had a better looking release, I'd actually be inclined to see it, because despite how dog shit this rip is, Flesh and Blood isn't terrible. For a start, it has a bizarrely good cast with a lot of actors they got early, like Tom Berenger, Mitchell Ryan, and of course Denzel Washington. Everyone is delivering, and we even have John Cassavetes somehow. He was well established by this time, so his fairly minor role in this TV movie does come as a bit of a surprise, but regardless, he obviously gives a good performance. The fight scenes are really good, the romance is handled well. The only things that make this remotely difficult is A, the runtime, which is unnecessarily long, 2, the awful quality I had to watch this in, and 3, the weird incest storyline that runs through the movie that is so unnecessary to making this work. This is above Virtuosity simply because I expected better from Virtuosity, whereas I expected way less from this. So Virtuosity may realistically be a better movie, but I just had a better time experiencing this one, if that makes sense. Anyway, now we have the most questionable movie on here, a movie called Heart Condition. Bob Hoskins plays a racist cop who gets a heart transplant from a dead Denzel who was a lawyer in his life. After the transplant, Hoskins gets haunted by Denzel, which is basically this guy's nightmare, and whilst being haunted they try to solve Washington's murder, a woman's disappearance, and along the way learn not to be racist. I mean, it's kind of like a buddy cop movie, and though it is entirely uncomfortable to watch and very pandering, it works enough. It's just so weird how everyone around Mooney accepts his racism. The white cops and stuff, sure, whatever, they don't even blink at it, but even the black cops seem to be not that mad, and they don't really seem interested, which I suppose talks to more of the time than anything, but like...
Come on, man.
Denzel is massively charming, and he had hit his stride as an actor by now, so at least every moment with him is at minimum amiable. Hoskins is doing great at his best, but the material he's given to work with is just subpar in the nicest words. Visually stale, and one that nobody, and I mean nobody, is gonna revisit. Oh, and Hoskins gets a heart attack at one point because Denzel screams the N-word at him like 4 times. Just thought you should know. Okay, at 48 we have our last TV movie, Hard Lessons, which aired originally as the George McKenna story, I believe, and this is a 5 out of 10 movie if I've ever seen one. It's the true story of George McKenna, who was a principal that started a job at George Washington High School, which was basically a crime-ridden, gang-infested public school, and he turns it around. Denzel played McKenna, who is actually a white dude in real life, which is a bit bizarre, and this film has like nothing to offer you if you've already seen like Lean on Me, Dangerous Minds, Freedom Writers, Coach Carter, and basically anything in that field. It's cliche and uninspired, and if it were not for Denzel putting in a very solid performance, it would completely be lost to time. But I've put it this high, quote unquote high, because in spite of its formulaic plot, Denzel is truly giving his best to this TV movie, at least the best he had to give at this point in his career, and it does have points that, though you know exactly where it's going, it's fun to see, and it's acted well enough to invest in it. So if you want to watch a TV version of Dangerous Minds with Denzel instead of Michelle Pfeiffer and without a great Coolio song, then this is the one you're looking for, I think.
We have gotten involved at Washington Preparatory.
Okay, at 47 we have The Preacher's Wife. It's one I have next to nothing to say about. Again, it's better than everything before just because it's kind of competent. Denzel plays an angel who's sent down to help a preacher and his family learn to be a family again. It's like a Hallmark Christmas movie, except better because it has just a better cast. I mean, the movie hits all the points you expect it to, but Denzel is doing Denzel. We have Jennifer Lewis being great comedic relief, Courtney B. Vance finding a great balance between likable preacher and unlikable family man, and Whitney Houston, who is not only completely gorgeous in this movie, she gets to hit vocals in the church choir every other scene, which elevates the movie much higher than its script should allow. And that's basically it. It's a feel-good Hallmark type movie, but with a cast that suggests otherwise, but I don't really think anyone's gonna find something spectacular here. And even though our next pick isn't spectacular either, we are edging ever closely to the movies I would just consider good. Starting with The Siege, directed by Edward Zwick, who has made fantastic movies and fantastic movies with Denzel, but this just isn't really one of them. I know I said we're edging closer to the movies I would consider good, but the next 3 I would just consider kind of fine also. But the premise of this is that there is a terrorist group who are making constant attacks on New York, inciting martial law under a brutalist military force headed by Bruce Willis's Major General William Devereaux. And Devereaux is constantly at odds with FBI and CIA agents Anthony Hubbard and Elise Kraft, played by Denzel Washington and Annette Bening respectively. There's a couple good narrative twists here and there, the tension building is commendable, and the movie overall is clearly made by a competent filmmaker. The screenplay itself is just a little lackluster that is thankfully saved by its main trio of actors who pull it up from the ground. There's good themes of the rights of citizens, and there's plenty of moral contemplating, but nothing all too special to warrant returning to. It's a fine enough movie to throw on whilst cleaning or cooking. It's a fine enough movie to throw on if it's on TV. But I just couldn't imagine going out of my way to see this again unless I am doing some kind of binge. Okay, next up we have Safe House at 45, which I feel is close to being a good movie. It's so very close. It is just let down by one significant factor, and that is Ryan Reynolds. I should preface this with saying that I think Reynolds is incredibly annoying as an actor. His comedy style is grating to no end for me, but I will also give him his dues and say that when he isn't doing his usual shtick, he can pull out a good performance or two. He's done it in Life, Adventureland, and he even finds a good sincerity in his comedy with things like Detective Pikachu. Hell, I think he even gives a good performance in the Amityville Horror from 2005, which by all accounts accounts is overall not a very good movie, but he specifically is doing well. Even in the first Deadpool, I think he found a good balance in that. So my bias against him is not really a factor here, because I can admit when he is doing something right. In fact, I think he does fine, but that's the problem. He's doing simply okay in a film that requires a whole lot more from him. The premise is one of those that is enough to carry a movie so far, but when combined with a good lead or two can become a standard rewatchable good time, like Taken. And this film is halfway there with Washington, who is really giving a world-class performance. He is not phoning it in at all. I believe him wholeheartedly as this ex-CIA renegade who's the typical most dangerous man alive type prisoner, but Reynolds really needed to give just as much, or just be replaced by someone who can hold their own next to Denzel to make this work as well as his potential could allow. The supporting cast is great. I mean, we got Vera Farmiga and Brendan Gleeson, Robert Patrick. It is just one performance away from hitting satisfyingly good material, but otherwise it's a fine enough movie. If it's on TV, this could run. And the last of the generally just okay movies, we have 2021's The Little Things. I know a lot of people don't like this one, and I can see why. It's essentially just a rip-off of Seven, but I think Denzel and Rami Malek give interesting enough performances to push this story through whilst actually getting a fine performance out of Leto too. People hate Jared Leto these days, and fair enough to be honest, but we can't just all pretend like he's incapable of giving a good performance. That's just incredibly disingenuous, and the same thing has been leveled against Malek in recent history too, due to his pretty undeserved Oscar win. But the guy really can act, even if it's mostly only one type of character. He's still very good at that one type, and that's exactly what this is. It's a well shot movie that has a classic detective story to accompany some good performances, and though John Lee Hancock is not exactly the best writer or director, I think he pulled just enough out of the bag to make this a somewhat passable time. It's the kind of thing your dad would watch on Amazon Prime, you know? Okay, so leading us into the first movie I would call solidly good, and this is where I'm going to start to have a bit more to say about some of the movies. Some of them not so much, but when we creep, you know, higher and higher on the list, the more I have to say will increase. Anyway, starting off at 43, we have The Pelican Brief. First of all, I cannot tell you how shocked I was to find out this movie was actually about pelicans, to some degree at least. I thought it was going to be one of them things where it's just the name of something without actually being about that thing in a sort of metaphor way or something, but no, this is actually about pelicans, kinda. The problem is that the film is all pelican and not brief at all. It is paced very poorly in my opinion, and though I think the premise, which comes from John Grisham's novel, has great potential, it just doesn't meet it. The idea is that two Supreme Court justices get assassinated, and Julia Roberts, playing Darby Shaw, jokingly puts together a theory about the deaths, and little does she know she comes actually very close to what actually happened. She's onto more than she thought. She becomes the target of assassination attempts herself, and her only hope of salvation is Denzel, playing Gray Grantham, who's an investigative journalist. It's a great story, and on paper this works for me entirely. Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington in a government expose story full of murder, corruption and political conspiracy, but the end result of it all is just this lack of potential. It's just a visually dull movie that drags its feet to the finish line. Though I will grant it does have a fairly tense third act. This is another film where the actors involved carry it to where it is, which is a shame because Alan J. Pakula is a director with huge potential, especially when it comes to thrillers like these. All the President's Men is one of the best examples of his capability. Even Presumed Innocent, which came out just 3 years earlier, is a much tighter movie, but The Pelican Brief just lacks the magic that makes this story work. It could do with either being more fast-paced, more paranoid in the vein of The Game by Fincher, or it could just maybe do with being schlockier instead, more goofy, more cheesy, something that a lot of 90s thrillers rely on. So yeah, there's some good stuff, there's some bad stuff, and overall I think the movie just comes out plainly good. It fell on its feet with its performers for sure, and it's very lucky to have Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington in this. Okay, next up we have Two Guns, and this is a movie with just an insanely fun premise, and honestly for the first act of the movie and bleeding into the second, it's super exciting and works for me entirely. The premise being that a DEA agent and naval intelligence officer are both undercover investigating each other whilst both are actually being set up by their respective sides. They build this fake friendship with their covers, and once they realise each other are undercover and they're being set up, they have to fight for survival together and learn to be actual friends with their real personalities, though they clash. It's a fun idea and I think it's executed fine enough, but I think a director with a real touch for action and buddy comedy like Michael Bay could have really made this something top tier. It's actually kind of jarring, this cast with this story around this time, it just felt like it was built for Michael Bay. But as it stands, Cormac does an okay job and I think it's a very easy watch. It's a Netflix movie if I've ever seen one. It's a film you throw on when you have friends over and you want to watch something cool and easy that you can also talk over and not really miss much. It's the film you have a decent time with but don't pause when you go to grab the pizza you ordered, and sometimes that's all a movie really needs to be. Okay, so now missing out on the top 40 by one place we have The Bone Collector, which is a kind of schlocky 90s thriller that I hoped The Pelican Brief would be. Though I don't think this is that much better than The Pelican Brief, it is far more rewatchable. Here we have Denzel and Angelina Jolie as they attempt to catch a serial killer known as The Bone Collector, which is just the stupidest pseudonym for a serial killer, but whatever. Denzel's character, Detective Lincoln Rhyme, is paralyzed, so he has to team up with a rookie played by Angelina Jolie to solve clues left behind by the killer. And if you're looking for an atmospheric 90s thriller that has some good actors, it's kind of in the vein of Seven but just not really as good. It's a steady kind of mystery with an unchallenging approach, then this is for you. The killer's motivations are a bit boring and anticlimactic, but the entire cast are giving such good performances that you can kind of forget about it. And I'm not just talking about the leads who have phenomenal chemistry, by the way, even when they're only communicating through walkie-talkies, but the supporting cast of Louise Guzman, Michael Rooker, Queen Latifah and Ed O'Neill are all giving us memorable parts. It's an oddly comfortable time, and one that won't expect much from you as a viewer, and that's either for better or for worse depending on what you want out of it. It's not Seven by any means, but it works, and that's about it. Okay, so entering our top 40 we have Roman J. Israel Esquire from director Dan Gilroy, director of Nightcrawler, and I wish that I could tell you that this has 1/10 the tension or execution of that movie, but it sadly doesn't. But what this movie does have is both a compelling narrative and a great Denzel performance, which is enough to carry any movie to the credits without being all too disappointing. It's just difficult because this film had a lot more potential. Denzel plays Roman, a lawyer who's the brains behind a law firm that's been fighting for the poor and dispossessed his whole career. Trouble comes when the firm's frontman dies and Roman is left to deal with the firm by himself, and he has to be the frontman, which he's just not accustomed to. He's never had to do this before, and he struggles to fit the new role whilst also taking on the firm's troubles that he was unaware of. There's a great supporting role played by Colin Firth, who is chewing up his scenes alongside Denzel, who himself is obviously doing exceptionally well in a particularly different kind of role for him. Roman isn't a badass, he isn't a cop or a confident man, he isn't suave, he isn't intense, he's introverted, potentially autistic, mousy. He's a liberal lawyer who has never had a real place of comfort. It's a challenge for Denzel and he handles it more than competently, and when doing a Denzel binge, it's very refreshing to see him take on such a unique role. I just wish the film went further with it so that it felt more worth the effort Washington is putting in. But either way, I think it's a charming and at times humble movie that has a lot of good ideas, a few great performances, and though it feels like it goes particularly nowhere, it's worth checking out solely for the performance Washington is gifting this runtime. Okay, next up we have Power, a film by Sidney Lumet starring Richard Gere with a supporting cast of Denzel Washington, Gene Hackman, Julie Christie and Kate Capshaw, which sells a movie that is much more promising than this one. Like the previous couple, this isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, it's just a little drab. It's the story of a political consultant who is helping an upcoming senator get elected expected, and it's just very slow and kind of boring. Richard Gere is doing great. He's honestly the only reason to keep watching, just like Denzel is in Roman J. Israel Esquire, but this film also has the benefit of having a fantastic supporting who are all given excellent scenes. Hackman especially, but there is one scene in particular with Washington which is by far the most engaging moment in the movie, but overall this is just kind of underwhelming and disappointing. The script is sharp and the directing is as polished as you'd expect from a veteran like Lumet, but you have to be in a very specific mood for this to hit, and even when you're in that mood, this is largely uncompelling when put next to other political and social satires like Network, which specifically feels like a distant cousin of this film. It's an intelligent film with a star-studded cast that doesn't quite meet the expectations, but is at least competently made and is a fine enough time. Okay, so now we're getting into the movies I actively like and watch often, starting with 1998's Fallen, directed by Gregory Hoblit, and this is the kind of true 90s thriller that we've been lacking on this list so far. Denzel plays Detective Hobbs, who recently caught serial killer Edgar Reese, who is promptly executed, but not before making ominous threats that lead to a series of events where killings start to happen again, but they're all in the style of this late Reese, and Hobbs has to figure out who or what's behind them. So this film isn't exceptional, it isn't exceeding any expectations, and it doesn't break any new ground, but it is a very reliable and gritty thriller with a solid lead performance and a great supporting from the likes of John Goodman and Donald Sutherland. There's a ton of tropes, cliches and trodden ground that's being reworked here, but it's all just so charming, a bit stupid for sure, but it is trying enough to be engaging, and when you have all of these great actors giving their best to this Seven style script, it's just a very entertaining time and reminiscent of a moment in Hollywood when this style of film could be made with as much style as this, with a cast like this, with a budget like this, and it just wouldn't really happen today, so I think this is kind of special in that way. I don't really have much more to say about it, it's just a very rewatchable thriller movie. At 37 we have The Book of Eli, which is maybe the ugliest movie ever made and has maybe the dumbest plot twist of all time, but it is saved and pulled from the ninth circle of hell by some outrageously good performances. We have the likes of Denzel Washington and Gary Oldman who are going way harder than they ever needed to. Basic premise is that Gary Oldman is trying to steal a book from Denzel in this post-apocalyptic world, because the book supposedly held the secrets to saving humanity. It's a fine enough premise and it's a very obvious plot point what the book is, which isn't really the twist. I won't get into the twist, but it's stupid as hell, and I know it sounds like I'm just kind of crapping on this movie, but it is actually really fun. It's super cheesy. Oldman is hamming it up like crazy. Denzel is in full badass mode, great fight scenes, great speeches, and played with more depth than what's present in the screenplay. It's the perfect movie to throw on with some friends for an easy time, whilst also getting some of the coolest Denzel and Gary Oldman scenes ever. Just a shame they're in like the blandest backdrop imaginable. Entering at 36 we have one of the most recent entries on this list, which is The Equalizer 3, the latest in the Equalizer series, and this I don't have too much to say about. It's a super easy watch, it's very beautiful, but it's just a very standard action movie that luckily has the benefit of being shot in a beautiful location and also having one of the greatest movie stars of all time in it. The intro is super engaging and some of the best stuff in the series overall, but the major problem this movie faces is that Denzel is just simply getting too old for these kinds of roles. Although he has reportedly signed on for Equalizer 4 and 5, which I will be seated for regardless, but the result of his age, which he admits himself is becoming an issue, is that the fight scenes are shot and choreographed in a very clunky way. But honestly, despite this being the third installment in an action series, the highlights of this movie are just Washington walking around the gorgeous sights of Italy and having genuine character interactions. It's a breezy little movie and one I need to revisit soon with a watch through of the whole trilogy. Okay, 20 movies later, at 35 we have The Mighty Quinn, which I think is one of the more underrated Denzel movies. It's a murder mystery set in Jamaica and it just is so weirdly chill for a crime thriller. Denzel and most of the main cast aren't Jamaican, but at least his Jamaican accent isn't as forced as his British one. It isn't amazing, but it's functional enough. The main problem for me is that anyone who's ever been around actual Jamaicans for any significant period of time knows that Jamaicans don't typically talk this slow or with this much emphasis on every word, especially around their own people. The film incorporates very little patois, everyone talks very slowly and legible, which I get, but it just feels a bit disingenuous, a little inauthentic, and it's clearly a movie made for an American audience first, so if you're Jamaican and you're looking for some kind of representation, I don't think this is really the best place to find it. But generally, this looks quite nice, a couple cool shots with reflections, plenty of beautiful colours, it's lit very well, exceptionally well in some cases, and everything feels like it's shot with intention. I would just describe this movie as charming. It has a beautiful soundtrack full of soulful reggae tracks, soca and calypso from true greats like Arrow, Michael Rose, Gregory Isaacs and Little Twitch, and the whole film bounces quite casually as if it's dancing to a smooth soca beat whilst going through this detective story. It's a solid time, nothing crazily impressive but nothing offensively bad either, it's just fun. Down at 34 we have The Manchurian Candidate, which is the Jonathan Demme remake of the 1962 film that I have not seen, and quite frankly I don't necessarily want to, because I like this movie a lot and I have no interest in seeing a different version of it anytime soon. It's just not really on the cards. I probably will get around to it at some point, but I'm okay with this being the only version I know for now. For those who don't know, the film is about Major Ben Marco, who begins having nightmares of when his squad was ambushed during the Gulf War. They were supposedly saved by Sergeant Raymond Shaw, but the problem being that Major Marco starts to believe that the story everybody tells is actually wrong, and he believes there's a governmental conspiracy behind it all. It's a super wacky premise, and one of those, just like the Pelican Brief, that goes all the way to the top. It's ridiculous and yet so much fun. It's a great thriller with all the suspense that you'd expect from a director of The Silence of the Lambs. And with an incredible cast of Denzel, Meryl Streep, Liev Schreiber, John Voight, Jeffrey Wright, Vera Farmiga and Kimberly Elise, it's absolutely stacked. And Denzel's performance is amazing. It's full of anxiety and infectious paranoia. He brings you in, along with the general filmmaking, and you really do get wrapped up in this conspiracy just as much as the characters involved. I think this has become one of the most vital Bush administration movies. It's choking on cynicism and political criticism, and it is so of its era that it comes right round to becoming timeless. And I know that's big talk for a movie sitting at 34, but like I said, I love Denzel's movies and he's in so much incredible stuff that being the 34th best Denzel movie is still better than being in most actors' top 5. Next up is Unstoppable, which I believe is the first Tony Scott movie we've spoken about, and yet that's notable because Tony Scott and Denzel's director-actor relationship is possibly my favourite of all time. Even more so than Denzel and Spike Lee, which is the one people usually talk about when it comes to Washington, although he does have quite a few good collaborators like Antoine Fuqua, Edward Zwick and even himself, but this movie is basically Speed but with a train, and instead of Keanu and Sandra Bullock we have Denzel and Chris Pine. Is it better than Speed? No, I don't think so, but it does do certain aspects much better. For one, Frank and Will feel like real characters. Both Washington and Pine are very good character actors, and they can bring a depth that may not be totally obvious to the average actor. This film is full of that 2000s action flair that Tony Scott was so good at. Intense and fast-paced action, saturated colours, a fierce score and excited editing. We have camera spins, we have a goofy premise, we have good performers, and I think it's a great movie for Tony Scott to end on. It's a shame that his passing took from us everything he was capable of giving us in his late career. Rest in peace, Tony Scott, you went out on a banger. Speaking of bangers, we have a massively underrated banger from the Denzel filmography, Courage Under Fire, which is a kind of military procedural drama that feels just as much like a suspense thriller. I was not looking forward to this one when it came round on my Denzel watch list, but man, I was really impressed by it. Plus we have Denzel Washington, Meg Ryan and a very young Matt Damon who holds his own very easily in these scenes with veterans. And honestly, going a step further, I think Matt Damon outclasses most of his peers in this film by a whole lot. He even steals a scene or two from Denzel. The idea is that a US Army officer played by Denzel is investigating a deceased commander's worthiness of a Medal of Honor. It's great to see how all these conflicting testimonies unravel different events of the same story. It's a movie that grips you more and more as it goes along, and it plays consistent games with you as an audience member, and is one I've been meaning to revisit and likely will come January. I don't really have much more I can say about this. It's just very competently made, very well acted, and I really just enjoy the story and how it unravels, but I can't really get into that without, you know, spoiling it too much for you, so I'm just going to leave it at that and just tell you to go and watch it. Right, so now we have our first Spike Lee joint on the list, which is He Got Game. It's a simple movie with a simple premise. Denzel plays Jake Shuttlesworth, who's convicted of killing his wife, though on accident, and he's been offered a shorter prison sentence if he can convince his son to go to a particular college to play basketball, since he seems like a big prospect. It's a simple enough concept, but the emotions are anything but. Of course, there's all types of complicated dynamics happening, but the relationship between Jake and his son Jesus is the focal point. And it's the thing that carries the movie. Jake is such a complicated character, and I think that's why it's so special that he serves as the protagonist as opposed to his son. He was an emotionally and physically abusive husband and father, but in a way that often gets rationalized in real life. He clearly loves his family. He didn't mean to kill his wife. He doesn't mean to emotionally distance and destroy his son, but he's a character that seems to just be recycling his own trauma and experiences, which is a very real thing. So him trying to backpedal on all of these inherited traits in an attempt to not only convince his son into doing what he needs, but also to reconnect with his son is interesting. Plus, with the way he's still constantly deceiving his son on the reasons behind his brief release and his intentions, the manipulation he's weaponizing is just a new form of abuse. But he just can't really recognize it as easily as his past mistakes. He's such an interesting character to portray and try to fit in all of these ideas and thoughts into. It's clear why Spike went to Denzel with this. The main problem with this movie, for me at least, are these ideas are all implied and extrapolated, but not much of it is actually explored in the text by the characters. It's a lot of interpretation, and though that is to some advantage, and for some movies that ambiguity is something to appreciate, this mostly just feels a little hollow instead. It's got a good cast once again, but the problem with the casting is Ray Allen. This man cannot act to save his life. I understand they wanted an actual basketball player, but this seriously could not be the best you could find. All respect to Allen because he's trying, but when you're next to Denzel Washington, it's a bit harder for you to just blend in with the rest of the cast. It's a good movie and has a lot going for it. I think it just needed to be ironed out a bit more and it would have shot right up here. But as it stands, 31 is going to have to do. Now, entering our top 30, we have Out of Time, directed by Carl Franklin. It's a part mystery crime thriller, all about the chief of police Matt Whitlock, who's attempting to solve a double homicide that he becomes the chief suspect in. It's a very exciting time with a very solid cast of Denzel, Eva Mendes, and Sanaa Lathan. It's set in Florida and thus comes with all the beautiful scenery you'd expect: big sunshine, seafront, and Hawaiian shirts all round. A film edited by Carol Kravitz, a Canadian, who contributes to the infectious pacing that so many 2003 crime thrillers had, and it's oozing with all the stereotypes of that time and genre: quick cuts, camera spins, cheesy but sincere dialogue, a happy ending, a few good twists, and absolutely drowning in intensity. And I've said it a million times, but movies were just better when Eva Mendes was in them, and this is one of the perfect examples of it. This is a movie that could be lost in the shuffle, but Eva Mendes brings her supporting role that easily could have just been a generic love interest to a genuinely likable and emotionally complex character. So yeah, if you want a fun crime thriller that actually delivers on its premise and is all in all not flawless but solid from head to feet, then check this one out. It's got a lot to like and has great rewatchability. Down at 29, we have Antoine Fuqua's 2016 remake of The Magnificent Seven, and I think this is where I'm gonna have my hottest take so far, since everyone much preferring the original 1960s western or the Akira Kurosawa film that inspired that one, Seven Samurai, and though I love Seven Samurai more than Fuqua's attempt at this narrative, I must say that I prefer this film over the Sturgis attempt, and that is mostly down to me not actually being in love with the western genre. A lot of the old classic westerns just don't appeal to me in a way that it does for a lot of people, but the 2016 remake has a modern flair from Fuqua that just appeals to me more. Besides, this film has a big boy cast. We have Denzel, Ethan Hawke, Lee Byung-hun, Vincent D'Onofrio, and Chris Pratt back when he was trying. It's a great story of a bunch of misfit gunslingers coming together to free a town from a brutish occupying force. It's not incredibly deep, not every character is fully realised, but the cast drag out every ounce of depth they possibly can. Especially Ethan Hawke, who is stealing the show in every moment he's present. But where the characters may fall short, I think the action, the performances, the score from the brilliant James Horner and Simon Franklin, and the beautiful aesthetic easily bring this movie together. It's a big, bombastic, fun gunslinging action movie that has heart where it counts, and I just really love it. So that's why it's this high. Okay, it's not going to be a future classic, I don't think, but I just personally really enjoy this. This is my kind of action movie. It's easily consumable, it's got some fun character interactions, and it has some really great action. Following that up with another Antoine Fuqua action movie, we have The Equalizer, the original. This is one of the first movies I ever saw Denzel in, and this is where I truly understood him as a badass action star. It's a John Wick Taken style movie with a retired unstoppable, insert whatever job title here, who is brought out of retirement to kill a bunch of guys to take revenge on a specific group of people. You've seen it a million times. But in my opinion, this and John Wick are about on par, and I think this has much more impressive fight choreography than that first John Wick film. It has a better performance from its lead too. But I guess John Wick does have this on visual style and world building, but there isn't a whole lot to say on this movie. It's just a solid fun time with a cast of veterans and Chloe Grace Moretz, just to remind you that this movie was made in 2014. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really have a lot to say on this. It is very much just a kind of standard action movie that's just done very well. I have it over Equalizer 3 because Denzel is actually doing a lot of these stunts, which allows his performance to just feel a bit more authentic in the other scenes too, but you know, that's where we're at. At 27 we have Ricochet, which to tell you the truth is one I have very little to say about as well. But what I do have to say is that this is another crime thriller starring Denzel Washington, because we have no shortage of those, but this time we have John Lithgow playing a mentally unstable psychopath, which should be enough to sell this on its own. But if it isn't, we also have Ice-T, so that's something, and I'm not fully able to explain what makes this so infectious to me. It just simply works. It's a cat and mouse story that has two of the greatest actors of all time doing what they do best. Denzel being a highly cool and charismatic action hero, and John Lithgow being a highly insane psycho with nothing but malice in his heart. It's scrappy, choppy, and altogether messy, but somehow stumbled into being unstoppably entertaining. Right, so now we have a film I didn't imagine would be anywhere near this high. It's the Robert Zemeckis 2015 character study and partial court drama Flight. It's surprising because Zemeckis is a director I have quite a lot of contempt for. I think he's truly one of the most juiceless directors to have ever walked on a set. At least after the 90s. His output since the year 2000 has been shocking in my opinion, so I really was not looking forward to Flight, which I pushed back my whole film watching career until it came time to fill in the Denzel gaps to make this video. But I have to say I was surprised with how much I liked this, and I genuinely think it is all to do with Denzel and the supporting cast. The story is that of a pilot who's a drunk and drug addict. But during one of his flights, there's a mechanical malfunction which hurls the plane towards the ground. In an incredible showcase of skill and experience, he manages to crash land the plane with minimal casualties. It's the closest thing to a miracle a mortal can achieve. Whitaker, the pilot, after the crash, enters sobriety, but when the investigation into the crash happens, his sobriety is tested as all accusations fall on him. It's a brutal character study and absolutely heartbreaking. Denzel brings his character to life, and he's talked about his relationship with substances recently, and I think those experiences manifest in his character here. There is just something so incredibly compelling about Whitaker's position and problems. Empathy is what this film is purely relying on. And I will give Zemeckis some credit. There are moments of this film that compel me in ways that I didn't expect, and it's down to his direction. As I previously said, the supporting cast is also helping this chug along very well, notably Kelly Riley, Don Cheadle, Bruce Greenwood, and most especially John Goodman. A brutal watch and surprisingly fantastic. Okay, so now we're entering our top 25, and it's worth noting that every single movie from here on I would consider incredible works. Starting with the first mention of a Denzel Washington directed effort in The Great Debaters, in which he also stars. Set in 1935 Texas, we follow James Farmer Jr. as he trains an African American debate team to greatness and eventually to being able to debate against the Harvard elite. It's the type of movie your teacher would show you in class on the last day of term. It's inspiring, it's conventional, but most of all, it's true. A solid cast that takes the screen and are able to just breathe. I noticed this in all Washington's directorial works, but because of his history as an actor, his directed efforts focus heavily on performance, so much so that any of them could even be stage plays, which one of them actually is, which is also a huge cornerstone of Denzel's career. He's a big theatre actor, so he brings all of these experiences and he translates what they mean to him and crafts something new out of them for other performances, and in that he creates something special. It's not the most revolutionary movie, I suppose, but I'm a film buff who just loves performers. Acting is one thing, but performing, that's another. And this is a film where every single actor gets to perform, including a young cast of upcoming talent, and the veterans like Forrest Whitaker and Denzel Washington also get to just perform. It's a poignant look at the oppression African Americans faced at the time, whilst also giving a new perspective on it. We've all seen the freedom fighter stories, the political figures, the speech givers. We've even seen it in gang culture commentary, poverty and all of that, but this is a fresh perspective, a debate team of college students using their limited platform to do something unheard of, and I think that's particularly special and powerful. It's such a great film, go and see it. Next up, we have another film of racial divide based on real events, but this time it's about a football team in Remember the Titans. Coach Boone, an African American, is appointed the new head coach of a football team, replacing Coach Yost, a white man in 70s Virginia. Along with this, the team becomes a racially integrated team for the first time, and both of these factors cause a huge divide in not only the team but the community surrounding it. It's an incredible tale of tolerance and coming together. It has a good baseline of seeing how similar we all are when we actually try to understand each other and make the effort. It's a great story, great cast, which includes a young Ryan Gosling who even gets to sing Ain't No Mountain High Enough in one really entertaining scene. Great acting, beautiful but simple story, and even more so than the last, this is definitely the type of movie your teacher shows you in school. There's not a great amount to say about it. It's just a very solid movie from front to back, an essential sports film and an all-round crowd pleaser. I can't imagine somebody really not liking this movie. At 23, we have The Equalizer 2, and the last Equalizer film to talk about, and it is comfortably the best one in my opinion. A sequel, to me, is supposed to keep the soul of the original whilst expanding on the world, bringing in new storylines and arcs whilst also maintaining the integrity of the previous arcs, up the ante where it can, and also introduce new characters to care about whilst continuing to make the returning characters compelling. The Equalizer 2 does all of this perfectly in my opinion. We delve deeper into Robert McCall's backstory and how his history shaped him, which enriches the previous installment too, which is always a bonus because a lot of sequels tend to take away from the original and have to take the characters down a level to bring them back up, which always feels cheap, but this film never does that. We also get introduced to a whole new cast of characters that layer the story in ever-evolving ways. We add Pedro Pascal to the cast as one of the characters, and he gives a very good performance in his limited screen time. He really holds the screen with Denzel, which we've established is tough to do. We up the ante, all the action set pieces are much bigger, thematically more meaningful, look grander, and overall choreographed much better. Denzel's performance is committed and as intense as ever, but this time has a lot more subtle sadness put into it. It's a great action movie, one of the best of the 2010s in my opinion, and yeah, if you've seen the first and only the first, go and see this one. I just think it's better. Now at 22, we have Antwone Fisher, Denzel's 2002 directorial debut about the true story of Antwone Fisher, who also happened to produce and write the film. It's the story of how he was a sailor in the Navy sent for psychiatric help from the Navy Navy psychiatrist Dr. Davenport, played by Denzel. It's a sort of Goodwill Hunting situation where he has anger issues and refuses to open up, but slowly softens up to his psychiatrist and they work through his issues through confronting his childhood. Eventually in this film he finds a family he never knew he had, and that's the gist of it really. Denzel has carved a niche in the inspiring movie department, and usually he isn't even the protagonist. He's usually supporting, but he always becomes the most memorable part, and this is no different. But Derek Lucas, the titular Antoine Fisher, does absolutely match Denzel's level in this movie, and the script gives him more than enough space to breathe on screen and perform, and coming from theatre, Denzel is just such a great scene partner, because he does his job when he needs to, but also allows his co-stars to get the most out of a scene with him and what they need from him. His chemistry with Luke is fantastic, and that's essentially all this movie is, an inspiring movie with two actors going absolutely nuts with the acting. And the acting isn't big and obvious and loud like a lot of people associate with great acting, you know. There's not a lot of crying or big monologues, you know, in the vein of a Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood, but this is so subtle but powerful. It's a great directorial debut, very strong and showed so much potential. It's a shame Denzel only managed to direct 3 movies so far, because I think he really has good potential as a director. As I said with The Great Debaters, though his visual style isn't incredibly striking and memorable, he allows so much room for performances, and as a result you get some very great scenes of just actors going at it. And this is a perfect example of that, with an even better one coming up later. Okay, so next up we have one that probably has no right being so high, but it's The Taking of Pelham 123, which is another remake, but I'm just gonna put it out there right now that there ain't nothing you can tell me about the original that is gonna overcome the fact that this is a 2000s crime thriller starring Denzel Washington, directed by Tony Scott. This movie is absolutely soaked in that 2000s style. It is sweaty and saturated, gritty, and buzzes like a junkie on enough crack to overdose. Denzel is doing a terrific job, but John Travolta understands this movie maybe more than anyone else. He is absolutely hamming it up, and every single line reading and physical decision is memorable. It sets its tone immediately with Jay-Z's 99 Problems booming over the intro credits, and the editing style is so frantic and greasy. I think this entire movie is the pure heart and soul of what Tony Scott was to me, and I think that's why I love it so much. It's overwhelming in the best way, and Travolta's last line is absolutely Oscar worthy. Argue with your mum, I don't care. Denzel is so charming, is so electric, empathetic, and gives space for Travolta to just go absolutely nuts. They are polars in this film, and nobody's ego gets in the way of that. It's brilliant. I love it. Go and watch it. It is so enthralling. Finally, we're getting to our top 20, and it starts with the movie that got Denzel his first Oscar nomination, Cry Freedom. The real story of an unlikely friendship between Donald Woods, a white South African liberal journalist, and Steve Biko, a black anti-apartheid activist who's been labelled dangerous. And I just absolutely love Biko's entrance in this movie. It's almost prophetic, biblical in a way that he's hidden as a silhouette among the trees and sunshine. And Denzel's accent work is actually very good in this, which we've noted has been his kryptonite in previous works, but it's perfect here. And it isn't just in short spurts of dialogue. There's an entire court scene where he monologues, and that accent doesn't waver once. Plus, it's some of Denzel's most effective work, entirely captivating, and this is where you first get a sense of his work in theatre, because this is a purely theatrical performance, not in the sense that it's over the top or performative, but in the sense that it's completely controlled. He's holding the stage, and he has everyone's attention in this auditorium we call life, and with the difficult subject matter, it would be easy for this to become a white savior narrative, but it doesn't. It maintains its integrity, and though the film mostly follows Woods, it's the black activists that shape the world he lives in. It's Biko who hands him the philosophies that he lives by. They save him. Kevin Kline is wonderful as Woods, and he bounces off Denzel really well, but this really is the Denzel show, which is so bizarre because, spoiler alert I guess, but Biko dies before the halfway mark. but he leaves such an impression that he's the lasting imprint of this movie. His character is the echo this film leaves you with, and that's entirely down to Washington capturing this especially magnetic and powerful human being. The film ends on these harrowing end credits that roll through all these unjust murders and how they were explained away by authorities. It's sickening and just the right tone to finish the film on. It's a golden movie and Denzel deserved the Oscar over Sean Connery in my opinion, but he got it 2 years later, so it all comes around eventually. Anyway, yeah, this is fantastic. This is why it's number 20, it's great. Next up at 19 we have Much Ado About Nothing, the Kenneth Branagh Shakespeare adaptation starring Kenneth Branagh himself, Emma Thompson, Kate Beckinsale, and of course Denzel Washington. And this was the first time in my life where it really hit me how sexy Denzel is, like Jesus Christ. I think this movie perfectly captures Shakespeare's sense of humour and how much fun his work can actually be. And I say this is the greatest Shakespeare adaptation of this play, including this year's Anyone But You, which I absolutely love in its own right. I think this should have been shown in schools personally. I mean, we've all had to endure Shakespeare to some extent. For some it was Romeo and Juliet, for others it was Hamlet, for me it was Macbeth. And though those are his most revered works, I think something like this play in this movie would mean a lot more to a younger audience. It's one of the Bard's most childish and whimsical works, very little darkness to it at all, and a lot of its plot revolves around gossip and things children do, like trying to set people up who are clearly perfect for each other. I don't know, it just seems so easy to enjoy and love, much easier than Shakespeare's more acclaimed work, which are more dense and thematically rich to be fair, and that's probably why they're shown instead, but still. And Kenneth Branagh does an excellent job of bringing this to life, not only because his whimsical directing choices have always been a staple of his filmography, but because the casting chosen between him and the casting director Pam Dixon is perfect. Branagh himself is such a likeable, handsome and goofy man, perfect for Benedict. Emma Thompson's strengths as an actress have always lay in her beauty, elegance, but also her sternness. Her ability to charm even when being offensive, which is Beatrice to a T. The rest of the cast, Robert Sean Leonard, Kate Beckinsale, Rich Briers, Michael Keaton, Brian Blessed, Imelda Staunton, it's also pitch perfect. There's Denzel of course doing absolutely phenomenal work, and Keanu absolutely nailing the shit-eating hater Don John in a role where he has to actually exercise some range which he usually doesn't do. It's a comfortable watch and one I'm going to get back round to before the year's end. Now we have A Soldier's Story, one of the most underrated movies on this list, maybe the most, when in consideration of how many people have actually seen it. It's the story of Captain Davenport, played by Howard Rollins, who's sent to a town in Louisiana to investigate the death of a black master sergeant who was shot outside an army base. The thing that makes this movie compelling is the difficulties Davenport faces in trying to find the culprit responsible. He fights the chain of command, which is prejudice against the black troops, and he fights against the black troops who are resistant to the investigation. Denzel plays one of the troops. He's a hard ass, but then again so are basically all of them. They have to be when considering their circumstances, but the dynamics are so interesting. There's a Sergeant Waters, also an African American, but it's harder on the black troops than any white man ever is. There's also Captain Taylor, who is a white man that is insistent on blaming two white soldiers for the crime despite there not being any real substantial evidence against them, only circumstantial. So Davenport has to fight against everyone's biases and cut right through to find the real murderer, and it ends up being a very tight murder mystery with some of the most affecting racial commentary I've ever seen. With its unique setting, its unique circumstances, its unique characters and unique location, you get something out of this you rarely find anywhere else. It's a cold, harsh and at times difficult watch that has you guessing till the very end. Then at 17 we have our next Spike Lee joint. It's Inside Man, which is another crime thriller, and I don't have much to say on this one despite this one being so high. It just has all the makings of a great movie, a cast of giants performing at their best, a score from Terence Blanchard setting every moment's intensity with a backdrop of brass instrumentation, sharp direction by Spike Lee which is complemented by the precise and snappy editing of Barry Alexander Brown, a very well constructed narrative, a layered but remarkably incredibly flexible script that allows these great character actors a license for interpretation, and a third act that is consuming and all-round satisfying. It's a simple story of a man trying to negotiate the lives of hostages. It's an easy and accessible premise and a good time anyone can take part in. Nothing really to add outside of that, I don't think. Okay, so next up, just outside the top 15, is the newest entry on the list, Gladiator 2. Now this may be a huge case of recency bias, so take this with a grain of salt, but I cannot help it. I find this movie so captivating, so glorious and refreshing. Legacy sequels don't get a whole lot better than this, for me anyway. The reception of this film has been generally positive, but also weirdly divisive, and I just don't understand it at all. A political historical epic that follows the original in such a fresh way. It thematically walks with the first movie whilst also never treading on its toes. The movie has a great finale that contrasts the first in such an interesting way. But of course I won't spoil it since it did just come out, but the movie is full of parallels and narrative symmetry, so it's important to make the deviations count because that's where the film will find its own identity. And it does a good job of it, especially in the third act. Denzel is a complete movie star in this, just completely engulfing every moment he's present. Mescal is far more charming than I expected him to be. He plays the same thematic function as Maximus from the original movie, but their characters definitely juxtapose each other in their mannerisms and interactions with others. People have criticized this performance and said he was miscast as he's meant to be rage incarnate, but Mescal is too cheery and whatnot, but I just find that criticism a bit flat. Being engulfed by rage and purpose doesn't always mean that's who you are entirely as a character. That's how you get boring and one-dimensional characters. I think Mescal's Lucius demonstrates that rage where it counts. The intro credits are outright gorgeous, being this painted interpretation of the events of the original film. The action sequences are super well done and up the stakes from the first, at least in terms of dynamics and scale, if not emotional weight. Pascal plays a morally grey character, which I think is a decent split from Phoenix's character in the first, who is a straight up villain that the protagonist must conquer to be at peace. Pascal walks in with that appearance but becomes more complex than that as the runtime goes on. There's loads to say, but I just think that it's a very well made movie with some standout qualities that aren't being given enough credit, and I enjoyed it far more than any of my peers it seems. I'm itching to rewatch it with the thirst as soon as I can. Okay, so an hour into this, we are finally entering our top 15. We have the movie that got Denzel his first Oscar, Glory. And this is an interesting one because it just doesn't feel like it should work for me. It's a historical biopic about the first all-black company in the Civil War, which is just a topic I don't care about. To explain, I don't care about war movies as it is. I don't love period pieces set before the 1920s, and I don't care at all for the Civil War as a topic, because it's just a piece of American history that seems to only really hold value if you're American. There's nothing outwardly epic or interesting about it to me, and yet I absolutely adore this movie, whether it's through the lens of the African American struggle and triumph where they had to put their lives on the line and eventually die just to be seen, whether it's through the lens of the performances from Matthew Broderick, Denzel, Carrie Elwes, Morgan Freeman and Andre Braugher, whether it's through the lens of the dynamics between the soldiers who have different degrees of loyalty to the Union as well as the white men put in charge of training and commanding them. Seeing how all these individuals with opposing relationships and views all come together to make a real mark in history, I don't know, there is just something incredibly beautiful about this movie. And through all the tragedy and the unfortunate end, you can't help but feel vindicated on behalf of the soldiers who suffered undeniably to be remembered. Not as heroes or activists, but just remembered at all. I was completely enamored by it, and this is genuinely the one and only time I've ever found the Civil War truly compelling, which is saying something. I definitely believe Denzel deserved his Oscar for his performance in this, and it's honestly unbelievable he'd only win one more, but we're not there yet. First, we got a few more, including including number 14, Philadelphia, a courtroom drama that earned Tom Hanks his first Oscar, which is absolutely deserved, I feel too. Definitely more than his stupid Forrest Gump win, but that's another topic, I'm not going to rant about that here. Philadelphia is about two lawyers with a past of rivalry coming together to sue a law firm for unjustly firing one of them due to AIDS discrimination. And it is absolutely flooring how spectacular this movie is, although you should expect nothing less from Jonathan Demme, who had just done The Silence of the Lambs before this. So of course a bulk of the narrative progression comes from these two lawyers, played by Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington, becoming unlikely friends as they attempt to fight back against a corrupt and prejudiced system. But in that, the characters themselves must deal with some inner conflicts. Beckett's being coming to terms with dying, coming to terms with being a gay man in a world that finds him disgusting due to his sexuality and diagnosis, but despite it, fighting his last good fight. Joe Miller's inner conflict is being both a minority himself, fighting against a system that is also weighed against him, whilst also learning to let go of his own prejudices in the form of homophobia. Now, of course, Denzel shines very brightly in this film. He brings a real humanity to his character that honestly could come across as entirely unlikable due to his homophobia. But Denzel finds a value in him. There's a chance to grow and be better, and he makes the audience believe that in his acting choices. But this really is the Tom Hanks show. The deterioration of Andrew as the film goes on is heartbreaking, and Hanks plays him getting weightier as the film trods along, but finding these bursts of energy to deliver some of the best lines and moments of the movie. It's aching to watch, but a powerful piece that touches on the AIDS epidemic that was at its height around the time the film came around. And it's a classic that everyone should see at least once. Next up we have Devil in a Blue Dress, which is a 1995 film noir set in the 40s that is just airtight from front to back. It's another mystery with Denzel playing a private detective who is on the search for a missing woman named Daphne Monet. Not a huge amount to say on this one, especially without spoiling the entire thing, but this movie is just stylish and is host to one of the most suave but also frantic and paranoid Denzel performances ever. It's a mystery that runs rings around itself, just like a classic noir would have, where you never quite know where the next turn is going to be, nor where you're going to end up. It's a classic display of writing from writer-director Carl Franklin, who also directed the aforementioned Out of Time. This is also host to Don Cheadle's best performance, which I appreciate isn't exactly difficult, because you're mostly picking between Rhodey and this accent. But in the few great performances he's given, I think this is by far his best work. Well, this or Eyes Straight on The Fresh Prince, it's hard to say. But yeah, if neo-noirs set in the 40s starring Denzel Washington sound like your thing, which it should, give this a go. Okay, at 12 we have the second Norman Jewison movie to be placed on here with The Hurricane. The story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, one of boxing's biggest what-ifs. Now, as a huge boxing fan, like that's my sport, I'm very familiar with Reuben Carter's story, but if you're not, Reuben Carter, also known as The Hurricane, was a middleweight boxer and a serious contender, but was wrongfully convicted of murder. In prison, he fought the courts multiple times to free himself, studying his own case and becoming very knowledgeable, but in the end he failed. However, after writing an autobiography, a kid learning to read in Canada chooses this as his first book. He learns Carter's story and believes him to be innocent, so he and his guardians work together to get Reuben Carter free whilst getting closer to the boxer during his incarceration. It's a story bursting with ups and downs, and I think captures something so special about the human spirit. There's a quote where Carter says,
"Hate put me in prison, love's gonna bust me out."
And it's something that encapsulates the whole movie. It realistically should be the tagline. It's cheesy and at times borderline eye-rolling, but Denzel is so committed to his performance, both as Reuben Carter the Hurricane and Reuben Carter the Prisoner, both requiring very different physical and emotional performances, and Denzel tackles both with incredible ease. He is truly undeniable, and though this film is on the lengthier side of 2 hours and 26 minutes, it's worth every second and is paced well enough to hardly matter anyway. Now, personally, as a boxing fan, I think Reuben Carter's career was very much heading downhill regardless, but the point is that we'll never know, and his story is so inspiring and reignites something in me to see it on screen the way it is here. And now heading to the film that just missed out on the top 10, we have Tony Scott's Man on Fire. Now take everything I said about Unstoppable and the taking of Pelham 123, about the editing choices, the aesthetic choices, the overall style and all of that, and it still applies here. here. I don't think I need to reiterate that much now, but yes, it's all back again, but this time is a revenge story, a redemption story, one where ex-CIA agent John Creasy goes on a rampage. And he's going on a rampage to hunt down and find a kidnapped 10-year-old Dakota Fanning named Lupita Ramos, whom he was tasked with guarding. Now, I've already said the 2 other movies on here are Taken like movies, but to use that film as a reference again, this is basically Taken but infinitely better. And also, I'm pretty sure this influenced Taken in a lot of ways. Denzel is at his most complex and badass here, and I think up to this point in his career was at his apex in terms of acting ability. Dakota Fanning also does absolutely wonderful in this movie, and considering she was only 9 to 10 years old when making it, I can comfortably say this is to me within the 10 best child performances I've ever seen. She puts so much character into Lupita that we are in just as much of a constant rage as Creasy is in trying to find her and solve the mystery. It's got a great cast outside our leads too, with Christopher Walken, Mickey Rourke back when he was good and you could look at him, and Radha Mitchell, who never starred in anything too great ever again, which is a shame because she's fantastic. Anyway, it's heart pumping, slick and explosive, one of the best movies of the 2000s and one of my all-time favourites. Finally, entering our top 10, and I should have mentioned this before, but everything past Cry Freedom onwards I would say, so everything from like 20 to 11 is near perfect to me. Some of my favourite stuff ever, but this whole top 10, everything on here is perfect. Everything on this top 10 could very well be my top 100 of all time, and some of it actually is, and though it is ordered, a lot of these could swap around and I'd be satisfied. And with that being said, at our number 10 we have Deja Vu, a movie I drastically underrated the first time round. This movie is one that has heart more than anything. It has all the same editing effects that other Tony Scott 2000s movies have, so it's just as Y2K, sweaty and erratic, but this movie just feels a lot more beautiful and gentle at the same time. I think out of every movie on this top 10, this is easily the most rewatchable. Some have pointed out that it's kind of like someone reverse engineered Vertigo and added in another act and some sci-fi time travel stuff, and I do partially see what they're saying. This does feel very much like a postmodern Hitchcockian attempt, but I think it's so much more than that. It's the story of federal agent Doug Carlin as he attempts to solve a crime using a secret government lab that can use what is essentially time-traveling surveillance equipment, but Carlin's heart is too great and not only attempts to solve the crime but use the equipment to prevent it, and in the process save a woman's life. It's a sci-fi action movie that verges on fantasy. It's pure action as well as romance. It's everything in a big gumbo. It's a film that turns hopeful theory into reality, and Denzel's performance is one of the most emotionally complex and beautiful he has ever given, and I think everyone owes it to themselves to experience this one. Now, sitting comfortably at 9, we have Mississippi Masala. Now, Denzel has been in a lot of movies about racial prejudice. He's often been in stories of clashing communities at trying times, and this is the same but entirely different at the same time, because in this Romeo and Juliet-esque story we follow Demetrius, an African American attempting to maintain a romance with his beau, Mina, who is Indian. Both sides of this love affair have their prejudices against the other, meaning their families. The clash of culture is almost too aggressive and it drives them apart. It's nothing outstanding in particular, but anybody that knows me knows that I'm a huge softie and a romantic at heart. And I love love more than anything, and that is everything this movie is about. It's about overcoming all boundaries, all societal rifts to make it work with the one person you need more desperately than air. And that's why it's this high, because I think it's a beautiful demonstration of that whilst holding on to some brilliant performances from Denzel Washington and Sarita Chowdhury, who are also one of the most gorgeous couples in any romance movie ever, I just must say. And I'm planning on getting the Criterion for this soon, and will definitely revisit it once I do. Now at 8 we have the last Denzel Washington directed movie, Fences. It's based on the stage play of the same title and actually features the whole main cast of the 2010 revival of that stage play, with the exception of Corey now being played by Jovan Adepo rather than Chris Choi. talk. And I think bringing over the original playwright to do the screenplay and bringing over the cast of the theatre production is incredibly smart and just shows how much love Denzel has for theatre. This plays exactly like it would on stage. There's no fancy Hollywood tricks. It's a straightforward, well shot but simply made movie. It's staged exactly like a theatre production, and that way it keeps its entire essence. Denzel plays a very charming alcoholic in Troy Maxson, and it's a character that feels very deeply rooted within me, because he reminds me so much of my own dad. I love him to death, but he's a drunk that always seems to charm but is always frustrated about something, is always lashing out on those around him, and I think this character is just a great example of generational trauma recycling. There's a big monologue in this where Troy explains to his son Corey that he doesn't owe his son anything more than shelter, food and clothes. Affection, and most notably the idea of liking him, is not on the cards. It's irrelevant. And that's definitely how a lot of parents view their situations, and it's just so incredibly sad and speaks on working class family dynamics and how some people feel burdened by their children rather than blessed. And of course Denzel shines, but Viola Davis holds more than her own in this movie, and she steals the spotlight from Washington on multiple occasions, but notably in the big argument scene. And I've rarely been so captured by a performance as I was by hers in this movie. It is truly something timeless. There's a character by the name of Gay, played by Michael T. Williamson, and my god is he so good. His final scene at the funeral is absolutely devastating because some emotions just break through communication barriers. Some things just break through any illnesses and conditions. That's the Way That Go is a great final line delivered by him because it means so much more than Gabe realizes as a character. And it just encompasses the movie because all of this craziness happens in people's lives, and well, that's just the way it goes. Nothing else to do but move forward. Some people build fences to keep people out, and other people build fences to keep people in. At 7 we have our last Tony Scott movie on the list, Crimson Tide, and this is easily my favourite war movie, though it is an unconventional one. The idea is that during the Cold War on a submarine, Captain Frank Ramsey, played by Gene Hackman, receives orders to fire nuclear warheads. However, before they do so, they start to receive another order before it is cut off. Captain Ramsey makes the order to continue with the missile launch as that is their last set of known orders, whereas Lieutenant Commander Hunter, played by Denzel, believes they mustn't take action until they know what the second order was in case it was an abort order. This conflict leads to the two clashing quite severely as the captain is very much the old guard and the lieutenant is very green, which leads to these underlying tones that the disagreement is more than just about the orders. The divide splits the submarine's crew and it leads to a slew of potential mutinies. The cast for this one is incredible, obviously Denzel and Gene Hackman, but Matt Craven, Viggo Mortensen, James Gandolfini, and even Steve Zahn makes an appearance. Everyone is giving great performances, but Washington and Hackman are just absolutely stellar in their elements, feeding off of each other. I mean, they were also both in Power previously, but their characters never really interacted, so this is the first time you see these two greats really go line for line, and it is endlessly entertaining. Super rewatchable, and I think is easily Tony Scott's best movie and easily the best script he's worked with, penned by Lean On Me's Michael Schiffer. It's dense, packed with layered but laid bare characters, a great but simple premise, and is directed in the most claustrophobic, tense and sweaty way imaginable. It's absolutely incredible filmmaking. Okay, so at number 6 we have The Tragedy of Macbeth, and this one I'm sadly going to cheat with. I have talked extensively about this movie, and I even have a whole video talking about it that nobody saw, so if you care at all to hear my thoughts on this movie, go and watch that video because I actually really loved what I said and I'm sad nobody watched it, so yeah, go there for my number 6. Okay, so now entering our top 5, finally we have many people's number 1, which is Training Day. And what is there to even say about Training Day anymore? It is Denzel's most quotable role, it is easily his most villainous role. I enjoy every single second he's on screen, and when you're acting alongside Ethan Hawke, who is known for stealing the show like he did in The Magnificent Seven from Denzel a lot of the time, you know you gotta bring your A game, and I think The Magnificent Seven was Hawke getting his own back because my god does Washington outshine every single other actor in this movie. And don't get me wrong, everyone is doing a great job. Ethan Hawke is obviously phenomenal, Scott Glenn, Eva Mendes, and even Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. The script from David Ayer is quite easily his best. Antoine Fuqua is doing a great job behind the camera to capture this gritty and pretty disgusting world Jake and Alonzo find themselves in, but at the end of the day, this is Denzel's movie. He is walking this script front to back, side to side. He runs shit here, you just live here. Every scene giving us a new quotable and a generational line delivery. And knowing basically the whole final speech and most memorable part of the movie is improvised by Denzel in the moment is mind-numbing. It speaks to just how engrossed Denzel was and how much he knew this character, maybe more than Fuqua and Ayer themselves. It's a ridiculously great movie, and I urge anyone who hasn't seen it to do themselves the favor. Next up we have Spike Lee's Mo Better Blues, and this is one I find difficult to talk about. This movie just feels like jazz. It moves in and out of motions, you never quite know where its next turn is going to be, you don't know what's going to happen, and that isn't because it's a film full of twists or crazy plot details, but because it just feels like a constant stream of events. It feels like life, it doesn't feel like a story. And it's full of actors that are so focused on their roles that this world just feels so lived in and existing because their characters do. There's juggernauts like Sam Jackson, Wesley Snipes, Giancarlo Esposito, John Turturro, Joy Lee, Charlie Murphy, Cinder Williams, and of course Spike Lee and Denzel Washington. It's colourful and emotional. It's not Spike Lee's best movie, but I think it's the Spike Lee movie that feels the most at home with itself. It also lets Giancarlo Esposito play a fun character instead of the endless variations of Gus he's been doing for the past decade. I haven't got much to say on this one. It's a great mood piece. It's up-tempo but somber, colourful and dark. All the makings of a great Spike Lee movie and a great Denzel performance. It's about a jazz player that can't really decide between two women in his life, but after an unfortunate accident he no longer has the ability to play his jazz the way he likes, but in the end he loses both women due to his indecision. But when he had jazz, he felt like he was on top of the world, like he didn't need to make decisions because women were endless to him. But when he lost that vital part of his life, by the time he had to make a choice when he needed someone, he had no options. It's a great tale and a warning of indecision, but more than anything, commitment and people's lack of commitment because they think, you know, their life's forever, their dreams are forever, their youth is forever, but it isn't. And that's not to say you need to tie yourself down to anyone, but it's to say that you can't play with people's emotions because they may not be around waiting for you all the time just because you think they will. Okay, so now entering our top 3. All 3 of these are in my top 100 movies of all time. I adore these movies endlessly, and that starts with Nick Cassavetes' John Q. If you've ever needed more proof beyond reasonable doubt that Rotten Tomatoes is a broken site and not worth taking seriously, note that this film has a critic score of 26%. What a joke. It's a film about a father, John Quincy Archibald, whose son needs a heart transplant, but because he doesn't have the money nor the insurance to cover the procedure, their son will likely die soon. Now, I wrote this little segment before recent CEO hitman troubles, and I think just as a result of that, the themes of this movie are more poignant than ever. Anyway, right, back to, yeah. Anyway, they try everything. They sell all their stuff. John goes through 100 different avenues to get some kind of assisted funding. They raise money at the church. They do everything they possibly can, but in the end, it just isn't enough. So, John does what nobody expects him to do. He holds the hospital hostage, along with a few of its patients, to get his son's name on the donor list. The wonderful thing about John as a character is that he's an incredibly good man and a positive role model who lives in a society that has forced his hand. He's given the choice to either let his son die or sacrifice his morals to give his son a slither of hope, and the joy of the film actually comes from the patients he holds hostage. They all create this bond, this kinship, because they understand his position, and he ends up helping all of these people with their problems. It's a testing story and one that has a lot of commentary on the healthcare system in America, and that healthcare system is heavily weighed against the poor or general working class. It's powerful, and Denzel gives his most emotionally ranged performance in this movie. He goes from heartbreaking cries of help to powerful monologues to loving father to desperate father to sacrificial lamb and back round again. He is doing all kinds of things in this movie, and I cannot believe it wasn't as well received as it should have been when it came out. And I've not even touched on the myriad of other timeless performances, notably from James Woods, Kimberly Elise and Daniel E. Smith. Also, this was directed by Nick Cassavetes, son of John Cassavetes, who featured in the TV movie Flesh and Blood that we spoke about earlier with Denzel 23 years earlier. I wonder if they ever spoke about that. I don't know, just something on my mind. Anyway, I adore this movie. It's absolutely incredible and a true emotional journey, and it's an essential watch in my opinion. I just think it's absolutely fascinating and troubling that a movie made over 2 decades ago is just as relevant today with its problems. And I think that makes it, in a way, sadly timeless. As is our number 2, which is American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. It's the true but dramatized life story of New York gangster Frank Lucas, who ran the heroin drug trade in Harlem after his mentor Bumpy Johnson passed away. And though I have throughout my life talked for hours about this movie, I've come into this video with next to nothing to say on it. It's my favorite rags to riches story, in that Frank Lucas is such a complicated figure that his initial success doesn't really feel like a win. He's played by Denzel very well, I might add, so we naturally want to root for him because he isn't as despicable as Alonzo from Training Day say. He's a gangster and he poisons his own community, sure, but he's three-dimensional, he cares and he loves for people, he takes care of his community when he isn't pushing heroin into it, he creates an economy for his family and friends. So it's hard to root against him too. Then there's the other side of the coin, Russell Crowe's Richie Roberts, a cop learning to be a lawyer who's chasing Frank Lucas but doesn't quite know it for a while. He has an incredibly complicated life. He's a do-gooder which doesn't serve him well in the corrupt police force he works for, and in the end his goals are to go above that and only serve those he believes are good too. The tagline for this movie is "There are two sides to the American dream," and I think that's so well worded and chosen because these two characters who are at odds, complete opposites, both end up in the end friends to some degree. Frank Lucas's story, at least this version of it, is both a story of triumph and caution at the same time, and when you tell that story in such a compelling way with such a timeless cast, it's impossible not to admire. I think it's close to Scott's finest work and has one of the most hand-over-mouth shocking moments in any Denzel film ever, and I won't spoil it here just in case you guys haven't seen it, but it's a great movie, I love it. It used to be my number 1, but in the end, if I'm really honest with myself, there's only one that can be number 1. And that's Spike Lee's 1992 classic Malcolm X. And just being real, I don't see how any filmmaker can watch this movie and decide to do a biopic. It's just so impossibly perfect that any attempt to even move within the same genre after its release should have been illegal. And coming into it, I think the idea to even do this movie is simply scary. Not so much for the filmmaker and writers, but for the lead. To play Malcolm X is such an impossible task, especially back then before anyone had ever really done it like this. Denzel was so undeniably brave in taking on this role, and he even admits himself that he wouldn't have done it had he not previously touched on the life of Malcolm in the off-Broadway production of When the Chickens Came Home to Roost. But Malcolm is intimidating, not just because of who he was, but because of how he was. He was a controversial and endlessly complicated figure, and this film gives him an honest look. It doesn't depict him as wholly good or a perfect role model, but it does aim to change his perception that was at the time and still slightly today of a dangerous and at times violent man. The idea I grew up knowing is that Martin Luther King Jr. believed in peace and Malcolm X was more of an iron fist kind of guy, two sides of a civil rights movement. But in reality, Malcolm was a lot more complicated than that, especially towards his end. The film was initially put into production by Norman Jewison after producer Marvin Worth spent 25 years trying to make a film about Malcolm X after acquiring the rights to his autobiography in 1967. It's quite crazy actually, because Worth had actually met Malcolm, who went by Detroit Red at the time. Worth went on to make a documentary about Malcolm which received an Academy Award nomination and went on to inform this movie. Sidney Lumet was at one one time attached to the project, but eventually Norman Jewison got attached, who cast Denzel as the lead due to their previous work in A Soldier's Story, and he would go on to cast Washington in The Hurricane 7 years later. But Spike Lee and many other fans felt that a white director should not be the voice that makes this movie, and thus Jewison bowed out very respectfully and Lee joined on and substantially changed the script. They didn't recast Washington because Lee had worked with him previously on Mo Better Blues and stated he wouldn't have cast anyone else anyway, and these decisions are integral to this movie because this is more than a biopic of Malcolm X. It's about his legacy, about black legacy, about how the struggles of African Americans then are still being felt now. The movie even opens with footage of Rodney King being beaten by the police force. This movie has an evergreen quality because although it's a period piece in reality, its content will always be contemporary. Malcolm's actual life plays with a sort of 3-act structure and lends itself really well to the film format, and Lee goes over that life in every act with intense detail and honesty and scrutiny. The film touches on so much. It scrutinizes organized religion as opposed to individual spiritualism and belief. It does a great job of showing the divide between Malcolm's beliefs and the Nation of Islam's beliefs. It shows his aggressiveness towards other black leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Jackie Robinson. He wasn't willing to play nice with the white man. He wasn't a man that compromised on his morals or his rights. But over time he softened. He cared more for everyone and wished for a world very similar to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. You know, Denzel does a lot in this movie that is simply made up, a lot of speeches and whatnot, but Denzel did his homework. He studied every speech and mannerism, he consumed everything, he just embodied the spirit of Malcolm. He made new material from being so connected to his soul, and it works so perfectly. He portrays Malcolm exactly how he was. He was intelligent and articulate. He rarely ever stuttered in real life. He rarely paused. He was a powerful speaker, and this movie puts that across so well. If you see this movie and wouldn't immediately follow this man anywhere he went, I don't know what to tell you. It is probably the biggest robbery in Oscar history. I cannot believe Denzel lost out on this. Anyway, I've spoken enough. My voice is going. I've been recording this video for hours and the whole thing has taken about 4 weeks to make. I'm so thankful for Denzel, but more so you guys for 3,000 subscribers. I hope you enjoyed me talking absolute shite for however long this video is. Knowing my luck, nobody's gonna watch it anyway, but it was a pleasure either way. So with all that said, whether it's one that stars Denzel Washington, the greatest actor to ever do it or not, as always, keep watching movies.